And as I think as our program and our relationship with the Narsi Munji Institute increases, you'll start seeing the sister schools and the best of each other institution join us. And for those of you who are in the alumni, who are current students of those institutions, welcome. For those of you who are part of our CAHO family or members of our centers of quality promotion or the extended through partnerships CAHO, whether it's domestic or global, welcome as well. Hopefully today you're in for a treat. I've got a dear friend of mine, Rajesh, who happened to be a colleague, but at a different place in the McKinsey and Company in the United States. And Rajesh is an unusual character in that he's got some enormous pedigree, both at an academic level, having studied at IIT Madras and MIT in the United States. He teaches at some top institutions globally, but also he has worked in some of the most prominent organizations in the technology ecosystem like Cisco and Dell. But the reason I really have Rajesh here, and I've had the privilege of knowing him over the last couple of years, is his capacity to communicate very clearly is sterling. And I think that is something that most of us, when we're learning, that communication is one of the skills that is truly rare, unique, and makes a fundamental difference in your success, both in a personal capacity, at least that's what my wife tells me, in a professional capacity, that's what most of my colleagues tell me, and more importantly, with the people that I respect and love around me, which are my parents, my kids, because they keep telling me, Dad, you could have told me this before. So I think with that, I think, Rajesh, the floor is yours. We'll make this interactive, but please take it away.
Thank you, Sam. I've tried to structure this as, I think for most people, to put it in practical terms, you might have 8 days or 8 hours to be kind of realistically to create a presentation. If you're doing it for someone else, someone says, I need something tomorrow morning, I have 8 hours, here's what you would do. Sometimes it's something you have a week, 10 days to prepare, so like about 8 days to do it. I've kept that in mind while I think about kind of some of the steps you would do. While creating a presentation, I've tried to give it in 8 steps. Hopefully that's useful as we go along. Little background, I think Sam did a fabulous job of kind of introducing me on the professional front. On the personal front, I think it almost comes to the point, I think I lived hardware, software, and I think then the next 20 years has been all slideware. I think probably what I have done in the last 15, 20 years is probably created or presented or sat in presentations pretty much once a day or twice or 4 times a week. So probably, as someone said, Lifetime Achievement Award on sitting in presentations, probably I would get one in sitting in presentations. And the content that you will see, I have used in the past, at least the majority of it I've used in the past when I've taught a course on communication for the Wharton Exec MBA program in San Francisco. So you will see some of those themes coming in there. I'm going to kind of ask a quick poll, and I think whoever's moderating the poll, just wanted to get a little sense of what's the audience. Just want to say, how many of you do your own presentations today? How many make it for someone else, or someone makes it for you? Like majority of it create your own presentations, at least just for the kind of summary. I don't know if you can see the poll results, 85% seems to be creating your own presentation. So I will keep that in mind as we go along. So that's kind of the 7 or 8 things that I focus on when we do a presentation. There's what I call number 1 is a story. At the end of the day, any presentation, you're trying to tell a story. You're trying to tell a story to make someone make a decision. You're trying to tell a story to get them to do something that you want to do. But at the end of the day, you are telling a story. And it could be a 1-hour story. It could be a 5-minute story. It could be a 5-hour story. But think of it, at the end of the day, you have to have a story. I think that's number 1 principle. And I'll walk through each of them in more detail. The others, I think, is the next one is what I call pyramid principle. The third one is keep it simple. The fourth one is separate what you say versus what you write. The fifth one is around colors. The sixth one is about sloppy presentation implies sloppy thinking. It's short for SPST. I'll talk a little bit about pictures and kind of animation and all of that, which I think people like to use a lot. And finally, close with preparation, because it's got nothing to do with the presentation itself. It's what you do after you've created the presentation. So I think I'll probably spend time on each of those. Let me start with something as a story as simple as this, right? So think of what is a storyline, right? So I think the simplest way I think about a storyline is a little cartoon, like you see in a magazine or Hindu or Newspaper Express. It's like 4 or 5, 6 panels telling a simple story. If you look at this cartoon, right, the story is very simple. There's a lot of detail in terms of how the nose is painted, how the hairs, like the hat is kind of drawn and the smile on the face. There's lots of little detail. But at the end of the day, the punchline and the joke is very, very simple, right? So I think when I talk about a story, that's what I'm talking about, having a simple kind of connected set of messages, right? And for you to create that, I think you have to take a few minutes, pause, and actually understand who your audience is, what do they know, what's their background, and what do you want to tell them, right? So that's kind of how I think about this as a story. I recommend this to do this like literally the first thing you do, right? So the first thing, because I'll give you a simple example. If you ask today, India went and lost South Africa and lost very badly in the one days, right? So, and if you're like selection committee and you are convening a meeting saying, I need to fix the team for the World Cup, like you don't even know what you want to do. Sometimes like, do I fix the middle order? Do I fix in like a more attacking bowlers, right? So if you don't know what you want to say, then the meeting will go all over. Not only will the meeting go all over, the presentation will go all over. So if you are kind of doing any presentation, my suggestion is to get that story right. Spend the first hour, first 10, 20, 30% of your time to get the simple story right. The way I do it is just kind of my things. I typically take little stickies, write them and sort them, right? And then the reason I use stickies is I might change the order and the sequence and play around with it, right? So some people kind of do it on a whiteboard, draw some panels and draw something there. Other people kind of write it as an exec summary. So I'll give you a simple example of a story. So if you're a company that's actually trying to raise money as a startup, which I think a lot of kind of smaller companies like kind of in the news, you kind of say, look, here's what's happening. A lot of companies are investing in technology, but there's regulation is slowing it down. The CIO needs to kind of is the person who's responsible for the slowdown. He is willing to pay money. We have a solution and therefore, and we have the experience, so please give us money. So a simple story like this, you might have a lot of details behind it, but you start with a very simple story like this. And then you can have a slide each, you can have 2 slides each, 3 slides each, but you keep that story simple. I think that would be kind of my recommendation, right? Some other people write the same thing as an executive summary. Some people kind of write it as a memo and then start from there, but these are different techniques people use. Right? So I'll give you maybe a little, Sam, I think you and I talked a little bit about it, right? We can kind of maybe take a very practical scenario and saying, how do we write the story, right? And I don't know about how many of you have children who haven't gone to school in 2 years. Mine is not gone in 2 years, right? If you want to tell a story for something like this, you want to convince the principal, let's kind of open school quickly, right? What would that story be, right? So it might be the president of the Parent Teacher Association making a presentation to the principal, right?
So I think to make this interactive, Rajesh, we can involve anybody who's on the committee. If you have ideas, please let us know. But it could be something as simple as my kids are driving me nuts,
okay,
right, at home, right? And my wife will divorce me if I don't get them to school quickly.
So that's one reason. Any other reasons you want to kind of add or others want to add? So for me, for example, I think a lot of people is if you have a working like family, and at least both me and my wife have kind of fairly busy lives, right? So our ability to do what we want to do is constrained. Yes, we like to spend time with them. We like to spend, but 24 hours a day kind of limits our ability to be kind of useful, helping other people, doing things like this. So I think as working parents, I think the burden on the family is a little bit kind of, I think, harder, right? And that's kind of another reason people talk about, right? So you can kind of craft it and write a few stories like bullet points like this, and then try to tie it together, right?
So we have some input coming in. We need some rest, kids' social skills, kids' education quality will improve.
Okay. So I think social skills is a fabulous one, right? I think a lot of people, like kids are so used to hanging around with other kids their age, they kind of learn how to handle conflict. They learn to kind of fight and they make up, they share food, they form long, strong friendships. So these are things you would kind of craft together. And so you might just say, put these things together. Maybe if you're working as a team, like 2 or 3 people, you can say, here are the points, let's organize them in a story, right? So you take the points, you organize them in a story, and then that is what decides the flow of your presentation, right? So if I did the same input like this, here's something that I would do, right? So I will open up schools immediately, please, because children are missing it. They have no interaction outside the family. There's been lots of distraction, and they're study at home. You have like grandmother saying, come and eat lunch, a friend coming and knocking, and or like there's a TV, sister is doing something else. They don't have any co-curricular activities whatsoever. Like there's to be like some drama, some play, some singing. None of that is happening. That's from the children's point of view. Now, how about the parents? Parents are missing. Even take the point of view of teachers, right? So we talked about kids, talked about parents, teachers, right? Some teachers are not everyone has the efficient infrastructure at home to actually do a presentation. They are much better, or teach a class, they're much better in the classroom. So this is kind of how you would craft a story on something as simple as kind of convincing a principal to start a school.
So I think from 2 comments we've had from Sippy and Shweta, we said also the mental health, kids' mental health development. I would also add that sometimes parents' mental health may need kids to go to school.
That's a good one, right? So that's definitely a good one, right? So you can have 8, 10, 15 pages, but at some point you realize that you don't need more than 10, 15 points to kind of make the point that they need to open school. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's kind of a little explanation of creating a storyline, right? Any questions on doing a storyline? Do you think this is something that you can do? And this should take maybe an hour, 2 hours. If you're working with someone else, you can write 4 or 5 bullet points, like say something like this in an email saying, look, here's what I'm thinking as the key points of the presentation. What do you think? Am I missing anything? You get input, then you test, right? So it also tells you like, oh, you're saying, okay, something about mental health, but do I have anything to prove that, right? Can I support this? Do I have any evidence? Can I get someone to kind of give me a testimonial, right? So that also tells you where some gaps in your content are. And it is better to find that out on the first day or the first hour rather than the last minute, right? So this logic is important to get right. Any questions? And Sam, I'll kind of rely on you a little bit. I think there's a lot of participants. If you see anything that's important and I'm missing, just call it out so that I will respond to those questions as we go along.
Yeah, I think so. I think keep running because I think this is what people are going to start getting excited for. Everyone has come here to kind of like figure out how to get promoted. That's what I promised them they learn.
So the next point I want to kind of like, you've got these ideas or points in a storyline. How do you organize them, right? So one of the most popular techniques I've learned is something called a pyramid principle, right? A pyramid is you basically having a big idea and it's basically like ideas that are built on top of each other, right? So let's take this example of something like sumo wrestlers, right? So sumo wrestlers are strong, right? So why do I say that? They say that because they practice a lot, they eat a lot, they compete in competitions, right? Now, how do they know they practice a lot? Like they train for 4 hours a day, they lift 4 times the weights, lots of weights a week. You can say, okay, they have like more than 300 pounds, right? So you can add other evidence, but you're basically organizing ideas in a very structured manner. So you're saying the big point is sumo wrestlers are strong. You have some supporting evidence under it. And then for each of those supporting evidence, you can have a couple of more bullet points to support it, right? So, and you can keep building on this. So if you have like a 1 to 2 hour presentation, you might have like 15 to 20 slides. You might have 3 to 4 kind of main themes supporting a big point, and then some sub bullets, right? And each can be a slide each, right? Typically, I think people say 3, like you can have 2 or 4. And after that, you don't need like 15 points to support that the sumo wrestlers are strong. 3, 4 is something like that you can do, right? I think Sam kind of teased up the question around promotion, right? So if I had to do this, I want to get promoted, how do you actually make that case, right? It can be as simple as like, I need a promotion because, right, my work is good. I've always kind of met my deadlines. and I help out my team, right? So kind of this is a simple logic, right? Sometimes you might not be like the more kind of Western way of doing it. You start with, I need a promotion, and then you say, here is why, right? But that doesn't work everywhere. And sometimes you don't want to lead with that. You might want to kind of lead with kind of the facts and then end up with the conclusion. So even the same pyramid that you have, which is a good way to organize thoughts, you can tie them back into storylines in a couple of different ways. One way you start from the top, right? You're saying like, this is my headline. I want a promotion. Here are the reasons why, right? That is works when there's a direct communication. Sometimes the directness doesn't exist. You might have to build up, right? So I think Sam talked about communicating with your wife. Sometimes this might work if you're trying to convince your wife to do something. You don't say, I want you to do this. You might have to start with something kind of the bottom, right? So give some facts and then try to kind of get to the conclusion, right? So the order in which you tell the story can be changed for the audience, but the structure still is robust. So you're saying, when I say make a statement, I need a promotion, you make sure you have supporting evidence. Don't have make a statement without the evidence under it. So if you take, for example, my work quality is good, then you might say, this is the last month, my quality in my labs, there has been 0 errors, or we have been meeting quality metrics for the last 12 months every month, and we have beat them every month, right? So you have some data to support each of that, right? So
and
this
just
is
to step in here, right? So I think if you link this to what originally Rajesh mentioned in terms of the audience, which is one of the key ABC of understanding the storyline. Let's say your storyline is not your direct supervisor, but your boss's boss, right? A P&L head of an institution. Some of the key ingredients, or what I would call the pillars that would support a good story for I need a promotion, is the company has had a record year in success. Our revenue and profitability has been exceptionally strong this last year. My department contributed about 45% of that to the overall revenue line, and about 60% to profit. And as you clearly see, I'm one of the most dedicated people in the department, and I've helped drive the success. I've always taken initiative. Those are examples of not just having a storyline, and this is a very simple way, but taking it one level higher based on quality of the audience that's there, but also if you raise the level of the pyramid as well. Remember, some pyramids in Egypt are not that tall, and some pyramids in Egypt they last for lifetimes, right? Generations across. So sometimes if you think through this, when you do the storyline effect, having this pyramid principle, that you really think through it from the audience's point of view, tends to be very successful.
And I think to build on Sam's point, what the audience knows, like your immediate boss might know that your work quality is good, you meet deadlines. But as Sam said, your like second level supervisor or third level supervisor might not associate you with these points. So you might actually have to introduce those facts, right? So similarly, if you go out and present to a public audience around some of the work you do, if you present it inside your organization, they will know more about your work, and it might be a lot easier to say, let's start with the outcome. Sometimes you go outside the organization, you might have to take a little time to introduce those facts and then build to the conclusion. So these are different ways. You have to understand a little bit of what people know and what their kind of mindset is. So if they are more positive to a promotion, it's a lot easier to start with the promotion. If they are generally don't want to give you a promotion, you might have to work your way. So you start with the facts and then build to the conclusion. Okay. Let me kind of maybe do a quick check on the poll in terms of who delivers your presentation. It looks like most of you create your own. This might be a little redundant, but I also wanted to understand if once you create it, do other people use it? So it can be maybe a team of yours who actually know the content and have done it. Oh, great, let me use your slides and do a presentation. Or one of the most common things is like marketing team creates a sale presentation and then 100,000 people use that presentation over and over again. Right? So that might give me a little sense of kind of, as I think through some of the specifics at the next level, how to kind of craft those aspects.
I think in this group, in at least the CAHO ecosystem and also in the Narsi Munji, if you're an MBA student, I'm assuming that you're doing a presentation for yourself. Unless you have a truly awesome guide who treats you to great biryani like Sriramji and gets you to do presentations for him for biryani.
So, no, I think as you kind of evolve in the organization, I think this is probably especially as the MBA students think about it, as you kind of evolve in the organization, when you actually do good presentation, people will actually say, look, I like your content, let me use it, right? And then how do you, I think some of the kind of the next level of detail, you will see, look, how do you make it also reusable? It's not just for you, because when you write it, it's easy for you to say it, but then someone else has to write it or you forward it along. There are some tips and tricks to kind of make sure those are actually relevant when used by other people. You can close the poll now, so kind of as we move along.
Sarji, even if you give biryani, right, it is very difficult to decipher others' presentation.
Maybe figuring out the right biryani to give.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Okay. Looks like there is at least some people, like only half the people make it for themselves. At least half the people, the content seems to be used by outside. So other people, so it's good to know, right? So thank you for that. So I'll give you a simple example of an executive summary. And this is, I think, one of the things that I think people struggle with is when you write something, and I picked the executive summary. It could be the slide, it could be the title, it can be anything else. And I've given a simple example. It's very easy to, you want to say, write everything that you want to say, right? So it's sometimes it's actually like, okay, I just want to make sure that nothing is missed, and every caveat and every little detail you try to write a full proper English sentence, grammatical error, like no grammatical errors, etc. Sometimes when you do that, it becomes very hard for the audience to process what you're actually presenting. So when you look at this, right, so the first reaction is people start reading every line. I don't know, in the last 30 seconds, how many people paid attention to what I was saying. They're all probably trying to read what's on the slide, right? And as you kind of evolve the presentation, you have to kind of do second and third iteration, right? I'll take some of this presentation and this content, and I'll try to remove a lot of redundant words in the sentence, just to kind of give you an example of how you can streamline this presentation, right? Or this content itself, which is the executive summary. If you look at this, a lot of this, you're basically focused on the weakness of the organization, right? You don't need to say major you just say focus is the weakness of the organization, right? Now, you are presenting, in this case, the presentation is to the management team of the company called Stocks and Bonds, right? So you don't need to actually tell them that you are stocks and bonds and this is like what they meant. So some of this information they already know. There's no reason to actually kind of define it, right? So here for you're saying like, oh, management committee, CEO, you say like basically the big point you want to say is there's no one head in the firm, right? So there's a lot of, so here you're giving you some examples of things that you don't have to write to put in the slide itself. Some of these you can talk. So when you present, you talk, right? When you say there's no single head in the firm, you say, look, then you tell an example of the CFO and the COO, they kind of, every time someone has to approve a budget, this person sends the request, that person sends this request, and you have a little story around it, right? Then that is the verbal story that you can tell. And since I kind of talked about other people wanting to use this presentation, it's very possible that the story around the message you tell might be slightly different from someone else. So someone in Coimbatore might be wanting to tell a story around the local hospital, while some kind of, I don't know, Pune or Hyderabad might have a different story, right? It might be between the CEO and some CFO as opposed to COO and the CFO. So you want to allow flexibility for other people to tell the story in their own words without missing kind of the key message, right? So one of the things I kind of end up doing is once you write the exec summary, I probably do 3 or 4 iterations on this, like multiple times, word editing, removing all redundant words, etc. I'll give a little kind of, so if I kind of did the finished product, this is what the exec summary looks like, right? So you look at it and saying 4 points, clearly that's the primary kind of message that you want to hit home, right? So I'll tell you a little example that I found like my kids did when they were in school early. And this is one of the things that when I did it, I found it very powerful. They wanted the kids to encourage writing, and a lot of people hesitate. I don't know what to write. I want to write a story. I don't know what to write. They never start, right? They encourage something called quick write. They say like, and they made the parent do it. The parent and the child sat down together. It didn't matter. They said, write for 10 minutes and see what comes out of it. And they made them write. It's very easy to edit after you've written first iteration. So don't worry about getting this right the first time. Just go ahead and write it. And then you do it 3, 4, 5 times. And it takes like 15 minutes every time you review the presentation. You have 8 hours or 8 days. Every time you look at it after like 2 hours or so, you will make some finer edits and it gets sharper and sharper as you get clearer in what you want to tell, right? So for me, the important point is don't try to write everything that you want to say. Just focus on the big points, put it on the slide, leave some room for you to speak when you present. Any questions?
I think one of the things that I've observed, and obviously it was beaten us, is simplicity of presentation, not too much noise on slides. So for those of you who are observing, you'll see that there aren't many things on the page. So your attention is actually kept by a combination of the page and what Rajesh is saying. Remember, the more you have on the page, the less you pay attention to what Rajesh will say or less the presenter will say. So keeping that balance is what matters.
So one of the things that people kind of, especially people who are very good with drawing and colors, get carried away with kind of different infographics and different kind of shapes and visuals, and they find something fancy, right? So one of my recommendations is try to keep it very simple, right? So because audiences don't have, you have spent probably 8 hours, 80 hours, maybe 80 days, or even 8 years doing something, and you're trying to capture that content in a slide. The person who is reading it might not have that knowledge, right? So I'll give you a very simple example, right? So if you're talking about representing growth, so someone says my company has been growing for the last 12 quarters, or my site has been growing for the last, I don't know, 15 months, right? As simple as if I'll show you kind of 3 kind of visuals, right? Which visual? The numbers are the same. The graphs are kind of presented slightly differently, right? Which one makes you think of growth? I hope most people will say the left one, right? So the numbers are the same. It's just turned left, right, and like flipped over. But at the end of the day, people tend to read left and left to right. People tend to read top to bottom, right? So when you think about growth, think about what is the simplest image that you want to kind of present. If you're talking about profitability, think of the simplest way to talk about something. If you're talking about mistakes, think of the simplest way, like a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old kid can understand, and try to use those, that visual, that graph, that picture, rather than trying to find fancy way. One of the challenges I think people end up with a very complex slide is someone has already created the slide, they like it and they want to use it. Okay, so my sense, sometimes you might want to pause and say, is my main message is one of the things that's in the slide? Let me have to recreate that one slide. Let me take a few minutes to recreate it. Right, that focuses only on the message. I'll give you this example, right? So this is a simple example of the stock market, right? If you look at it, where does your eyes kind of focus on, right? You can kind of put your response in the chat, right? What do you see first? So I see graph, but what do you see in the graph, right? So what aspects of it, right? Right. So you see growth. Someone says they see growth. Someone says, yeah, 52-week high, right? But there are lots of other things that is not needed. If your primary message is around growth and peak, you don't need a lot of things. You don't need like the fact that there is like volume at the bottom in the stock trading thing. You don't need like how that there are like, you can do this at different. So you see like some people say the colors. So there's lots of noise around this, right? So my suggestion is something as simple as this, right? You don't need everything else. You just say, look, the Dow Jones or stock market was 21,000. Now it's up 20%. That is the primary message, because this might be the message you want. If you're presenting to, let's say, a stock analyst and you want to say, look at, I don't know, February and look at this volume drop, then it's a different kind of a slide that you want to do, right? So if you are telling to someone, look, on the over the last 1 year, there is some reds and some greens, it's a different message, right? It's very hard to kind of focus your eyes. People are looking for the message. If your objective is to show growth, keep it simple. All you want is the growth. You don't need anything else. Focus on that 20% mass growth, right? So that would be my kind of suggestion, to keep it simple. Think like someone who's actually not very familiar with the content, and so that they focus on the message that you want to kind of communicate. In this case, it's a 20% growth over the last 1 year. Any questions?
I think this is very clear. It's after you do the storyline with an audience in mind, you've reordered that, made sure that you have the pyramid principle where you're building up to the right headline story or the right anchoring points, and then keep the slides very simple with the core message of that slide.
The next question, just kind of quick pulse check. What's your typical audience? Do you have small rooms? Do you have like a typical team of like say 50, 60 people, which is kind of a small department? Or do you end up in large auditoriums of 200, 300 people? Looks like most of it is small and maybe a little bit on the kind of the medium size, right? So one of the things I think it's important is when you're using things like colors, fonts, etc., it's very easy to kind of get carried away. Look, I am guilty. I have spent like hours and hours trying to get the fonts and things right. Even for this person, like I'm like, okay, what do I do, right? Because if you have a corporate template, it's a lot easier to kind of work off it and saying, this is my recommendation, or someone does it for you, then you don't change it a lot. In terms of color schemes, etc. But when you're doing it on your own, you tend to get carried away with lots of colors and jazz and what you want to do. The point I want to make here is colors, fonts, etc. When you use it with a purpose, right? For example, between the left and the right, there are two simple, same graph, identical data, no different. The left is a lot more busier, a lot more colors. You don't know what to kind of focus on. There's reds and blues, and right, it's kind of don't know what the primary message is, right? On the right, for example, you want to focus on just one player, who's player one, who's improving, who's highlighted in blue, right? The others are like lighter color, purposefully downplayed, right? So when you use colors, use that with purpose. So for example, in this presentation, I tended to use reds to highlight a few things, and then most of it is black and white. So I think I kind of judiciously reduced the number of colors I use. I reduced it to kind of 2 or 3 colors, red being the primary color to highlight. So same thing with fonts, right? People have like 15 different fonts in a slide. My recommendation is don't use more than 2 fonts in a slide. Maybe one for the heading, one for the kind of primary content. If you depends on the audience, if you're presenting, see who can read it. Like I think some of the most popular joke is look at the oldest person in the room and divide their age by half and saying like that's the font size you use. So if you have a 50-year-old person, try to use kind of 22, 23 point font so that people can actually see what you're presenting, that the person is actually kind of can see it. Because if you go 12 point font, 10 point font in presentation, they might not be able to see it and follow along, right? My suggestion is to keep 2, maybe 3 fonts in a page. So if you want to have footnotes, something, you might have a third font, which is smaller size. Keep the colors. So I think when it talks about colors, I tend to use mostly standard colors. Don't use a lot of different colors, maybe one color to highlight, and then keep it natural. If you have a company template or a company color, feel free to use that. Because once you change it, it becomes very hard for other people, especially if it's corporate presentation. If they want to reuse it, it becomes very hard. Okay? As I kind of walk through this, if you have any other specific questions around like the presentation mechanics, feel free to kind of ask on the chat, and I'll try to answer some of those, right? The other question people ask is, how long should my presentation be, right? So I typically plan for maybe 4 to 5 minutes per show. If you want to have our maybe 12 slides is probably as much that you can handle. You want to have a little room in the back for some question and answer. You want to have some time for people to settle in, for introductions, etc. So not more than 4 to 5 minutes per slide, right? If it's a large audience, you might take a little longer to walk through the slides, maybe 6-7 minutes. I wouldn't do anything more, right? So the other question people ask is an agenda, right? So in my experience, agendas make a lot of sense if you have a really long day, right? If you have a whole day of meeting, then saying like first hour is this topic, second hour is this topic, and then go along. If you have a 1 hour meeting, agendas typically don't make a lot of sense, right? So any other questions, Sam, that's come up that I should?
Yeah, I think there's a couple around questions. So we have from Tangam, who is one of the rock stars in the nursing world, which colors to avoid. We have from Regina, is it okay to use different colors in comparing different parameters on one graph? And from Sam, which colors can we use? So I think a color kind of question, if you have a perspective on it.
Sure.
And font style.
So when you are in a room, sure. So I think a couple of things that I would keep in mind. Let me answer the colors. If you're in a small room, typically 15, 20 people, I think that's kind of half the audience here. I generally prefer light backgrounds and dark font, like colors, right? So like something like white, black on white, or something like that. I would like black on gray. Like I would keep it light, simple. Blue is very popular and mostly kind of friendly on the eye. I might use green, for example. Blue and greens people like a lot because it's just pleasing on the eye. Reds work for certain, if you really want to kind of you want to bring in energy, reds tend to work. But reds for finance, if you're doing a finance presentation, red has a negative connotation to it, right? So people don't like red if you're presenting the CFO and asking for money. So I would avoid red for something like a budgetary ask or taking an investment. If you're presenting to a creative audience, then kind of sometimes the rules get a little relaxed. Most business audience, you might tend to do with white, with dark on white. If you're doing large presentations, if you're doing an audience of something like 1,000 people or so, I think the light on dark tends to work better in large auditoriums. I think that is my personal experience.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to this is obviously also think about printing, because sometimes you might have to print, or somebody will want to print the slides and keep it in front of them. So using certain colors that are not print friendly, or fonts that are not openly available to everybody's, let's say Word or their PowerPoint or their Office equivalent of PowerPoint, I think is dangerous, because then it'll come up as gobbledygook sometimes. And sometimes that font utilization means it's very faint on a page, or it might suck out all the ink of your printer, and then the finance guy will be chasing you with the red ink anyway. And there goes your promotion.
Correct. And I think even like other thing I tend to do with fonts is I try to avoid fonts that have lots of curls and curves and all of that. Keep it simple and kind of crisp and clean. Some of the modern fonts are there. And I think one of the things that I think Sam called out, which is around printing and distribution. So I think a lot of people do have Windows, but I think Mac is now, I think people view it on Mac, people view it on like mobile phones, people view it on iPads, things like that. So for me, not everyone might have PowerPoint viewer in the desktop context, right? So say maybe even making it as a PDF so that it's visible and uniformly visible in every kind of device you should keep in mind as you think about what you put in here. Any other questions?
I think let's keep going. We'll come back because I think you're going to cover some of these in the next few slides.
Sure. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to cover is a little bit around some of the details, right? And sometimes people wonder why it matters. In my opinion, I call this like cleaning behind the refrigerator or painting behind the refrigerator, right? So if you call a painter and ask him to paint like a table or a chair or something, most of them skimp on under the table. They don't paint there, right? Because then no one looks, right? It's just kind of easy to skip, right? If you ask them to paint the house, they'll say it's behind the refrigerator. No one is going to look there. I won't paint there. You look at the kind of inside the shelf, at the bottom of the shelf, these guys won't paint, right? Or girls won't paint, right? So for me, like when you actually notice those and you notice those little things, it's not that itself, oh, how am I going to make $1 million decision because I missed a kind of a comma or a semicolon or something. It's more about it reflects what you have been doing, right? It comes across as a sloppy presentation thing, comes across as sloppy thinking, sloppy work, right? It's more about how you are perceived as a person. So I'll take this slide as an example, right? So probably many things that are wrong with this slide, right? So if you have any kind of, I'll look for some comments in the chat window and I'll walk you through some of the things that are wrong with it. If you have any kind of comments, feel free to type in saying what you think is wrong in this slide. Little things that kind of communicate an impression that is sloppy.
Come on, guys, let's make it a bit interactive. Spelling, great. Product financials. Yep.
Right. Spelling mistake, number overlaps, right? Right. Repeated cost, right? Okay, product 3 has no numbers. Good, right? Right. Good, right? So that's kind of an indication of something, right? Here is kind of what I would call out as some of the things that I kind of noticed, right? So that didn't have a title. You didn't know what these numbers meant, right? So there's like product financials. What product financials? Is this profit? Is it revenue? Don't idea, right? You basically want to say this is year-to-date financials by product, right? And maybe even can be even better. I should say year-to-date revenue by product, right? Or profitability by product, right? It tells you what time period, right? So that people know this is for a particular time period, because 1 month later, this number might be, they might have a different number in their head, right? So you're saying it is for this period, right? It talks about, I think we talked about a little bit of the number overlap, and product 3 didn't have some of the numbers. So we call those up, right? The thing that you're trying to focus on is Q2 has not been profitable. So you want to call that, this is revenue. Actually, this is revenue, cost, and therefore this is the margin. That's the financial, that's here, right? But that is not the focus. So you want to call this out saying this is revenue, this is cost, this is margin, right? Where did you get this information from, right? So that people can go back and say, if they want to test the numbers, check the numbers, repeat it, they can do that, right? So these are some of the details that I'm calling about. When I call out saying details matter, sloppy presentation means sloppy thinking. These are the little things that I'm talking about, right? And I personally, for example, I know I'm not good at it. Sometimes I actually have someone else look through it, right? Even the presentation today, right? So I had kind of done it, and after 24 hours, I noticed 1 or 2 spelling errors, right? So sometimes you might want to have someone else look at it just to kind of make sure they correct the errors, right? It might be someone who is on your team or someone who's just good at copy editing, right? So who's like good at looking at little details, finding this out. Take a few minutes to get this right.
Yeah, I think you've covered a lot of these, some great observations, decimal spaces, whether we can put dollars right at once. You don't necessarily have to keep repeating the word dollar everywhere. Some good suggestions. Go for it.
Next kind of question, right? Little bit of who's your audience, right? What's your typical audience? One of the things I think the audience matters is it kind of tells you what they know already, right? So that affects how much you put on the slides, how deep do you go into content, what level you keep the kind of the information. So if, as Sam pointed out, we discussed it earlier, if you're talking to the 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th level boss, he might not know some of the operational details, right? So that kind of, my suggestion would be to kind of understand and prepare, right? So create the slides, but slides is just kind of the first step, or like one of the steps, an important step. But when you deliver the presentation, take time to understand who they are, where are they coming from, right? If you're actually presenting in a new place, go to the location. I typically, like if the meeting is at 10 o'clock, I end up there like 8:39, right? Like I'm like traffic is like, I can't find parking, directions, they get lost. Sometimes the mics don't work. Sometimes you don't find the room. You don't know where the audience is, how big it is. So I get there early, right? Take time to understand, right? Preparation is kind of, in my opinion, underrated. You kind of, some people prepare like keep changing the slides literally till the last minute, right? So like 5 minutes, 10 minutes before the slide. They don't, like sometimes when the slide shows up, they don't even know what's on it, right? So my suggestion would be to kind of spend a lot of time preparing, understanding the audience, understanding the location where you're actually presenting, understanding your content, understanding what the content the audience knows. But finally, most important, what's your objective, right? So some meetings you want a decision. At the end of the day, make sure you like, I want approval for a budget, or I want a promotion, or I want, I don't know, collaboration with you. I want you to identify 2 people from your team to work with me. So what's your objective? Sometimes it might be as simple as information, right? I just want to kind of inform you and say, this is what we are doing. So sometimes it's typical status update is just to inform people, this is what we're doing, right? So then in which case you're saying, okay, this is what I've showed you. You have any questions, you have follow on, right? I would spend a lot of time in getting preparation after you've done the presentation, so that how you talk through or think through how you want to deliver. One of the things I do is what I call as role play. I go in my mind what I would say. So for example, in this presentation, I knew it was starting at 5. I probably at 3 o'clock or so, 3 to 3:45, I had a dry run in my mind around saying, what are the slides? What am I going to say in each of these slides? When am I going to kind of invite some input and response from the crowd, etc. Right? So I would probably spend a little time getting that. Make sure you bucket and budget time for that as you go along. I think we have another 5 minutes, Sam. I'm kind of
I think we can take a bit of time, but I just want to add to that, right? So different people will have different styles. One of the things I've observed in my life in McKinsey, which had some brutally tough projects and some really fun projects. And the fun came out with where the discussions and the interactions around meetings and PowerPoint were very focused around getting a specific objective function or so what. So if you're very clear what you want out of a meeting right up front, if you're able to articulate that, think about it. So for example, many of you might be in quality at the moment. And therefore, I would like to communicate that our clinical indicators are not improving and therefore could use with some specific ownership. Could be an objective function of you as a clinician in quality trying to communicate to a broader theme. The way of communicating the number of slides you need actually doesn't have to be that big. So I spend a lot more time trying to figure out the audience, the target audience, the objective function, and then I try and minimize the number of slides. And I don't tend to do too much work on slides. That's a personal approach to doing things. But when I was very early in my career, like an MBA student once upon a life in Kellogg, you like to kind of impress upon people that you've done a lot of work. What you find is that actually think about the word PowerPoint. It's the power to get to the point, right? And therefore, if you use 25 slides to get to the point versus 3 slides, which do you think will have more impact on the audience? Which do you think somebody at the end of that meeting will say, wow, because you could probably have finished that meeting in 10 minutes, had a nice conversation and gone back to the folks around the target audience and had very different perspectives. So I think those are additional things. And I think what you're adding, the picture, putting the right infographic, that puts 1,000 words. That India has won a World Cup. You don't have to say that. That's our friend was the man of the match and single-handedly turned the match. That it was a team effort. And it was a proud day for India. You don't have to say any of that because this picture says all of that, right?
Sure. So I think, Sam, I do want to kind of echo the couple of points you mentioned, right? One is the objective of the meeting is not for you to talk, right? The objective of the meeting is for everyone to talk and decide. So kind of keep that in mind. So you actually want to have time for dialogue and discussion. So I would kind of focus on that, right? So the point, I think this point I skipped over is, unfortunately, I think technology skipped over, is the point. I think someone asked a question on chat saying, how much do you do pictures and others, right? I am all for using pictures, but
I think the sense is, look, on most slides, my McKinsey experience is 2 is probably about it, one on the left and one on the right. That's a maximum. When I've seen more than 5-6 pictures on a slide, my attention on which picture is drawing my attention, I'm actually decreasing the amount of message. It's like the more articles that are put in front of you, do you give that much importance to one article? If a newspaper on the headlines has 10 headlines, am I able to remember one? And that's, I think, a great test for a great communication message, that if you can remember a message a day later, it's a good communication. If you can remember it a year later, it's a great communication. If you can remember it 10 years later, and by the way, there are people who have done this. Anyone who sat in Steve Jobs' first Apple launch remembers that meeting, right? So I think it's having those memories. If you just go back for yourself and look back at some of your best presentations where you've been in the audience, what has been the key message that you have absorbed? I think that is a great rule of thumb to figure out. It was never the number of slides. The more slides you have is not it. It's never the number of pictures. You seldom remember all the pictures anyway. It is the message and how the storyline has compounded that story and left that message as an undying, locked in content in your head. Neelam has got an interesting question. And I think we can perhaps do that while presenting trends. Should we do data in tables or graph or both? I think it's, Rajesh, it'd be great to hear your view on this, and then I can give 2 cents.
Sure. So I think, again, I come back to the audience, right? So if you're presenting to a finance person and you're presenting finance numbers, give them the P&L. They know how to read it. Don't spend time to kind of put it in graphs and et cetera, right? But if you're actually having a group of fairly kind of diverse people, finance, marketing, HR, things like that, and you are saying, like, we're talking about some profitability numbers, sometimes those graphs help, right? So when you're having an audience, so think about what the audience understands. If everyone is like a accountant, they'll know. You don't have to spend time like, this is P&L, this profit is going. You put them there like an account, like a balance sheet or an income statement. They know exactly what 5 numbers to go look at, right? So I would think about that, right? So if you're presenting to, for example, finance to a medical group, which are all doctors, maybe visuals might work better, right? So that might be more, graphs might be better. Right, so that kind of is that would be my recommendation.
I think that's great insight, right? Audience. I think the same for the video. Obviously, the younger generation likes videos more. We're hearing that people whose education level is perhaps not as sophisticated, videos tend to communicate a much deeper message to a lot of them. And that's why advertising on TV has been such a huge industry historically. So I think body language and attire, absolutely critical. I think you would have all seen the data that it's the visual communication represents less than about 10 to 15% of overall communication. Sorry, the verbal communication. Visuals about 30% in terms of what you communicate with the pictures. But the rest of it is form, pitch, and a whole bunch of other things. First, Rajesh, thanks a lot. I think this was, I put you in a spot about a week ago and you kind of like came through for us. So really hats off. I think this was a great program. I'm sure you will get a lot of welcome invitations at different events. So if your popularity increases, just remember me. I'll always be happy to be your junior moderator to field questions and to field your fan club. I think second, thanks our friends from Narsi Munji and the many audience members. Without you, this wouldn't have happened.